So let's begin with some basics. By geopolitics, we're obviously talking about the politics of geography. We are talking about the way that terrain and land inform political relationships between states, but we're also talking about the populations. So remember, half of geopolitics is demographies and the people on the ground, so to speak. Now, when we look at things that can affect geography, apart from the physical features of terrain, we're also talking about the way that space interacts with people and informs their psychology. For one, when you're talking about how a sector of population views their identity, you're looking at their neighbors, you're looking at the landscape and how that influences their identity, you're looking at a sense of place there. And a lot of this is covered by Flint in the introduction to Geopolitics, as well as his references to Agnes within it. So in Geopolitics, John outlines what's known as a sect analysis. As a sect analysis, we're looking at 4 things to try and break down our understanding of geopolitics. The first one being sovereignty. So we are looking at the way that a nation state has sovereign control and jurisdiction over a particular area of land. That has massive implications both for security as well as for jurisdiction, legislation, and we will see these come into force a little bit more when we talk about borders. E is for economics. Now, economics is obviously the most obtuse part of geopolitics because we're talking about money flows, we're talking about trade, we're talking about the way that politics surround the interactions of trade. It's a bit hard to ground, so to speak, economics in this manner. And the way to think about it is resources feed into economic activity which support the population, which is vital for the stability and security of a nation. So economics is kind of the structure of a nation's geopolitical relationships. The third one is C, which is it's ideology, but we use culture as a shortcut for ideology. We are talking about the way that particular facets of ideas and ideology and even doctrine shape people across particular areas. As we will see later when we come to Huntington, Huntington uses his civilizational thesis to divide people roughly into cultural areas of the world. And a lot of that is informed by religious ideology. However, during the Cold War, we were also able to see the way that the West and the Soviet era, the West and the Soviet worlds were divided into 2 based on ideology. And last but not least, T, territory. That's clearly the most obvious one. When we use territory, we're looking at the physical structure of land. Now, we've actually done a bit of an interesting thing, especially from a Marxist perspective, and I use this sort of as a way to understand it. When we talk about E, we're talking about structures. We're talking about the relationships between people in society and the way they operate through economic activity, through consumption, through waste. When we talk about C, we're talking about the superstructure. So the way that ideas are processed at that high level. And finally, T is obviously the infrastructure, which is the basis from where we get our material wealth, the basis from where we get our food and sustainability. So that is how we do a sect analysis. So it's fair to say that without Mackinder, we wouldn't have our conceptualization of geopolitics as we have it today. Mackinder's thesis is particularly infamous and particularly influential on all of geopolitics with his heartland theory. His heartland theory was a massive departure from Mahan, which was a fairly dominant thought of how politics interacted across space. Mahan's theory is that they who control the seas will have the greatest forms of mobility and therefore the greatest ability to dominate political influence. And this was observed through the way that the British island was able to dominate a whole third of the earth. Mackinder, however, observing the success of the emergence of rail, said this is no longer the case. And in fact, as rail became more and more significant, the influence of sea travel to extend and project your power became less significant as rail was much faster to mobilize ground forces. And so Mackinder's famous rubric is he who controls the heartland, controls the world island, controls the world. For him, there was a geographical pivot in the center of, well, Central Asia really, largely centered upon Ukraine and surrounds. And the reason it's a geographical pivot is it's served as a fulcrum. If you're able to stand there and manipulate the geographical pivot, you can determine the course of history, change the fate of the world. It is an axis upon which things spin. And so this is Mackinder's core idea. Why is this place so significant? Well, it has centrality, and do not underestimate this, because from this single point, you're able to project a base of power outwardly from there. It has natural abundance of human labor and human resources to do work, and it was rich in material wealth. So all of these things meant that the heartland was highly geostrategically important. Mackinder was also rather well known for commenting upon how the Russian Empire had great desires for this area, particularly Ukraine. And in fact, the strategic imperative that he came up with was that Europe, or at least Western Europe, must thwart the Russian desire to acquire these areas. Since then, Mackinder's core ideas of the heartland and the centrality of this place have continued to influence other authors and other scholars. In Colin Gray's Inescapable Geographies, he attempts to link the way that geography feeds into politics, and his particular rubric is that politics is merely an extension of geography. One of the things he's doing is he's actually drawing from Clausewitz, an earlier scholar on political sciences. And Clausewitz is infamous for saying politics is war by other means. So both of these scholars are attempting to say that politics is predetermined by one phenomenon or the other. In the case of Clausewitz, Clausewitz is saying the threat of war or the problems of security is so paramount that all effects of politics are concerned by how strategies and security plays out. Gray borrows from this, and what he is saying is that the realities of terrain, the realities of our economy, the realities of everything geopolitical is so powerful that they predetermine the way we think and act upon politics. And often there is going to be an overlap between considerations for security and war and considerations for terrain and how that predetermines our politics, I guess. So Doyle talks to us about empires, and his work is attempting to describe to us or theorize to us how empires come about and how the state of empires occur. There are a number of views that he draws upon, noticeably Hobson, Lenin, and Schumpeter. Now, in each of these, he looks at the conventional view of what you might call the metropolitan view. Now, the metropolitan view is basically an idea predicated on domestic product, a demand for domestic product. In particular, he sees there's this economic drive. So when you have a nation where there is a widening gap of money, so there is an impoverishment at the lower level and an enrichment at the top level, it tends to push towards imperialism. This is because as goods get manufactured, the wealthy already tend to have the things being manufactured, while the people in poverty tend to be unable to afford it. And part of what it does to react to that is looks for alternative markets outside of its area in which to supply these goods and provide these goods for trade. When it becomes imperialism is when there's an extra level of administrative power or materialism on top. So it's not just merely a form of trade, but an exertion of influence over the given land. Now, each of the three theorists that he looks at, Hobson, Lenin, and Schumpeter, look at the way that capitalism has a relationship with the expansion of imperialism. In particular, for Lenin's the easy one. Lenin basically sees imperialism and capitalism as two sides of the same coin. For Lenin, the expansion of empire is a consequence of that empire needing to find these markets and using its military annex to acquire them. For Hobson, it's more about monopolistic controls and the way that expansion is followed through. Expansion creates a, how would you say? Expansion follows a particular pattern of interest in these foreign lands where there's a relationship of control and monopolization. By that, I mean the companies within a nation are looking to control their area of interest, and to do so, they expand outward to other areas where they can access resources and those markets, and because the companies expand, they take the nation with them. Schumpeter says some things that are fairly similar to that, in that capitalism is a driving force for this kinds of expanded activity. But for Schumpeter, capitalism offsets the imperialistic tendencies. Capitalism provides a great equalizer by the way that market forces help redistribute interest and choice. These are obviously very different perspectives on how economic systems work, but in regards to them being driving forces of imperialism, they're all agreeing that this push for capital and this push for markets has a relationship to its expansion of power. Hobson and Lenin see this as being a fait accompli for imperialism, while Schumpeter sees it as a checkpoint for the tendency of authoritarianism within that. That's largely how Doyle is explaining the rise and wherefore of empire. So let's consider for a bit the way that Haushofer took Mackinder's politics and used it to form the geostrategy of the Nazi Party and the Nazi Reich. So Haushofer very much agreed with the idea that Mackinder put forward of the centrality of the heartland. In the heartland was such a massive amount of wealth and resources that the Reich had to simply acquire it for its own success. And in fact, part of what Haushofer did was he took the strategic imperative and helped formulate a justification for why they should gain access to that land. And we see this in Lebensraum. And Lebensraum is this idea where a particular people are entitled to a land by dint of their might and by dint of their capacity. And obviously this is where we start seeing some of the notions of subhuman status of beings. So Haushofer took Mackinder's work, found a justification for expanding into lands that were outside of Germany proper, and that led to the new form of imperialism under the Reich. So Harvey Starwell, not a proper theorist, wrote to us about the importance, or at least some of the ways that we can reconstruct the meaning of borders for geopolitics. Harvey Starr drew upon two main sources. So one of the ones that he looked at was Hertz's hard shell theory, and this is more of the classic idea of a border. For Hertz, the border was the definitive boundary, the hard shell, and it was the area that the nation securitized itself. However, we also have Diels, which is the notion of the critical boundary. Now, Diels kind of agrees with Hertz in the way that borders represent a particular limit for security, but where he disagrees is Diels basically talks about the legal threshold and not just the security threshold. So there is a line there somewhere, and that is purely just a legal barrier. But what we do to act upon it represents the way that the boundary manifests. In particular, he says that there is a certain point at which the nation reacts to the intrusion of hostile aliens, so agents of a foreign nation or perhaps even refugees. And that is what signifies the critical boundary. So Huntington was one of many theorists attempting to formulate an American grand strategy with the wake of the end of bipolarity. In doing so, he is attempting to ask, where is the future of conflict going to come from? There is no longer a Cold War going on, there's no longer a Soviet Union as an enemy. Part of his response is to divide the world into civilizations. Civilizations, for him, are effectively units of culture and territory divided at the highest level of organization. There are several features he sees being paramount to defining a civilization. One of them being language, one of them being ethnicity, and another being religion. When these elements are in play, it is considered that a civilization will be divided by these values so stringently that where they meet, they will inevitably go to war. And in fact, these points of meeting he calls fault lines. It is possible for a fault line to run through a country, and the particular one that he uses is in the Ukraine and the Balkans. We look to Huntington as a way to possibly explain why conflict becomes more exaggerated in these areas, or why conflict can become very volatile. Huntington is subject to some criticism because a big part of his work goes towards dividing the West and the rest, and in fact sets up Islam and the civilization of Islam as the next great big enemy for America to contend with. Now, while that rhetoric may seem to be playing out, it's hard to say whether that would have occurred without American provocation or whether it is a direct result of American provocation. But either way, Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis claims that the civilization is the source of new conflict. Krauthammer is one of the three American grand strategists. In particular, he talked about what was called the unipolar moment, i.e., the bipolarity had ended and now America was in a prime position to seize, well, not so much seize power, but to assure its political and military dominance across the world, be the unipole, the single power. Interestingly, Krauthammer actually said that America's unique position at the time, its military capacity and its influence across the world, not only meant that it needed to take a role in world politics in the same way, but that it was justified in doing so, not because of any kind of moral obligation, but a more might is right way. One of the particularly interesting predictions that Krauthammer came out with was the notion that there was a 30-year window for this period of dominance, and that when those 30 years expired, the superpower status of the US would go into decline. Now, you can look at potentially China's rise, maybe that's an end to bipolarity. You can look at even Germany's particular power and Russia's expansionism, and maybe we're ending a period of unipolar power and entering into sort of a more multipolar world. Now, Brzezinski represents the third of the three grand American strategists that we've been discussing. The first two were largely asking the question, where to next in the wake of the end of the Cold War? However, Brzezinski more formally addresses these questions, trying to ask, well, we are far from the central landmass of Eurasia. How do we, on a different continent, on a different hemisphere, ensure that we have a dominance of power over the Eurasian continent? So his work follows on loosely from Mackinder by saying, yes, there's this central focus, but he then creates or surmises 5 other geographical pivots as choke points to control this central heartland, such as South Korea, such as South Korea, Iraq, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and the Ukraine. All of these are on the outer crescent, and you'll see some similarities here to Spikeman's theory. Smith provokes us with the question of when is a nation? He is trying not to ask merely what is a nation, but also provoking us to consider that a nation doesn't just exist as an entity in space, but also has a history across it. So it's when is the origins of a nation are rooted in its history. Part of what Smith is attempting to do is show that there are generally 2 trajectories in which a nation emerges. One of them is the ethno-cultural, which is a grassroots form from bottom up. This is often more tribal, where the sense of nationalism is driven through ethnic and tribal and cultural ties, and works towards a higher sense of organization and self, versus the civic sense, which is a more modern phenomenon. The civic form of nationhood comes from a top-down perspective, where it's generated by the state and solicits its citizens and its subjects to participate in the civil society and the public affairs, to be part of that nation. So its sense of identity is one of participation through a central civic process. Continuing these ideas of nationalism, we also have Anderson on imagined communities. Anderson's core idea is that nationalism was the consequence of a range of people experiencing an imagined community. That is, a sense of community that extended beyond their physical immediate reach and extended all the way out to a range of other people that they've never met before. So this imagined community is this notion that there are people that you share an identity with beyond your immediate vicinity. Anderson also said that this imagined community emerged during the 17th and 18th centuries, largely because of the emergence of what he called print capitalism. That is, the printing press as an invention allowed the dissemination of the written word, and through this you had consistency of ideas, you had consistency of thought, you had consistency of language, and so there was a medium by which people from disparate areas of a region could communicate in a consistent and contiguous manner. Now, the other part of it was the capitalism. Capitalism being the method by which print was rapidly disseminated. So capitalism has mechanisms in it that when an invention or an instrument becomes profitable, it quickly sends it to various parts as other companies will take it up. So the method was the printing press, but the reason it spread so quickly and enabled communication across regions was the instance of capitalism. And that is the core behind an imagined community. We're now starting to get into the way that globalization has affected security and nationalism. We start with Barnett, and Barnett imagined the relationships of the world being divided into what he called the functioning core and the non-integrated gap. Now, the functioning core roughly equates to the developed world. Specifically, what defines the functioning core are a series of nations who have either formally or informally or through participation agreed to participate in a set of security norms that mean they're at least by certain standards of war and conflict. These are thus nations that have less tendency to go into massive war with each other. The non-integrated gap, on the other hand, does represent the areas of underdevelopment around the world. And for him, the idea is that these areas must be integrated into the functioning core, largely through globalization, largely through economic opportunities. And so by offering and developing these areas with these opportunities, it will cut out many of these troubling aspects, integrating them. And in particular, Barnett's new map says that the US has a particular role in this, namely as exporters of security. They will do this through two main methods. One is what he calls the Leviathan, which is like a giant hammer that can be sent in to smash any aspects of opposition to this international security regime. And the other being more like an international maintenance or a peacekeeping regime, so that does all the groundwork and the maintenance on keeping this new world order. Kaplan talks to us about the rise of Chinese power in the 19th and 20th century, and in particular the way that geography is relevant to understanding Chinese power. Part of this is the way that China expanded and acquired the two provinces Tibet and Xinjiang. Now, these provinces are both rich in natural resources, fuel and oil in Xinjiang, and lots of minerals in the Tibetan highlands and the Tibetan plateau. Plus, also, the Tibetan plateau is the head font for half the world's water, to be honest, or at least half the world's population's water, I should say. Now, Kaplan also points out that China has an extensive seaboard, which is very significant to its geopolitics. This is because while it has access to the ocean, that ocean is thwarted by island chains that surround it. This includes South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and Indonesia, as well as several other nations. These lands oppose Chinese easy expansion into the Pacific, and it is because of these that China has never had the same kind of foothold or preponderance and dominance in the in the Pacific Ocean as perhaps other powers in the area, such as the USA, of course. China's ambitions in the South China Sea represent two major aspects. One is by expanding into the South China Sea, China can secure the sea lines of communication which ensure that its supply of oil, 82% of its supply of oil, can come through the Strait of Malacca and up into its homeland. More importantly as well, not more importantly, but significantly, there is also a mass of natural resources in the South China Sea. So there are reasons to acquire this territory beyond that strategic purpose. China has made territorial claims across South China Sea, much to the contestation of many of the other islands, for their territorial claims overlap, extend, and often come at the expense of these other territorial claims. O'Hara gives us her ideas around the great game or the grubby game. That is, she is observing of the Central Caucasus that there might be the emergence of a new great game, particularly between China and Russia over the Central Caucasus. This is because of the development of the oil fields in this area. China has a strong desire to develop pipelines into this area so that it can access the oil directly across land without having to ship it across the sea to Baku and then down through the Persian Gulf and into the Indian Ocean, which is a very long way for 82% of its oil to travel. Well, this is part of that 82%, I should say. Russia also has very strong historic ties, as they are former Soviet stands, they're former Soviet members. Each of these five nations have deep economic ties to Russia, to the degree that a depressive effect in the Russian economy can have catastrophic effects to these areas. So both these giants, hungry for oil, are working precipitously to try and gain an influence here. However, the grubby game is also a reference to the notion of petroaggression. This is the idea that the sheer abundance of oil and other kinds of natural resources, but in particular oil, tends to foment petroaggression, or a more belligerent stance by a nation towards other nations. So here we see an example of the presence of oil leading to greater levels of conflict and instability, and that this is being capitalized upon by the two great powers seeking influence there. So this concludes my walking vlog of Paris plus Geopolitics 101. I hope you've had fun. I've certainly really enjoyed it here, but as I will not be seeing you this week, adieu.